Story 1. The Rest Stop. The Midwest highways were known for their endless stretches of nothingness, where miles upon miles of road seemed to blend into the horizon with only the occasional gas station or diner to break the monotony. Jess, Mark, and Emily had been driving for hours, the excitement of their road trip slowly giving way to exhaustion. The sun had long set, and the darkness outside their car windows was thick, almost tangible. "We should have reached the next town by now," Jess said, her voice tinged with frustration. She was driving, her eyes darting between the GPS and the road ahead. "Maybe we missed a turn," Mark suggested from the passenger seat, though his tone was doubtful. "This road feels like it's leading us nowhere." Emily, who had been half asleep in the back seat, sat up and stretched. "Maybe we should stop for a bit, take a break. My legs are cramping up." As if on cue, a sign appeared out of the darkness. "Rest stop ahead 2 miles." The sign was old and faded, the paint peeling away, but it was a welcome sight. Perfect timing, Jess muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She signaled and took the exit, following the narrow road that led to the rest stop. The headlights of the car barely pierced through the dense fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The rest stop came into view, a small, decrepit building with a few parking spaces out front. There was a single street lamp casting a dim, flickering light over the area, and beyond that, nothing but darkness. "This place looks like something out of a horror movie," Mark joked, but there was an uneasy edge to his voice. "Better than nothing," Emily replied, though she didn't sound convinced. "Let's just stretch our legs and get back on the road." Jess parked the car, and the 3 friends got out. The night air was cold, much colder than it had been earlier, and it carried an eerie silence. No sounds of crickets or distant traffic, just the low hum of the car engine cooling down. "Let's make this quick," Jess said, rubbing her arms as if to ward off the chill. Mark and Emily nodded in agreement, and they walked towards the building. The door creaked loudly as Mark pushed it open, and the smell of mold and dampness hit them immediately. The inside was as uninviting as the outside: cracked tiles on the floor, peeling wallpaper, and a couple of old vending machines that looked like they hadn't been used in years. "Ugh, it smells awful in here," Emily complained, covering her nose with her sleeve. "There's a bathroom sign over there," Jess pointed out. "I'm going to use it real quick, and then we're out of here." Mark nodded and wandered over to one of the vending machines, eyeing the stale-looking snacks inside. Emily leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone, trying to get a signal but failing. Jess pushed open the door to the restroom and immediately regretted it. The air inside was even more putrid, and the fluorescent light above flickered erratically. She hesitated, but then shook her head. "Just get it over with," she told herself. As she entered one of the stalls, she heard the door creak open behind her. She assumed it was Emily or Mark. "It's disgusting in here," she called out, but there was no reply. Jess finished quickly and stepped out of the stall. The restroom was empty. "Emily? Mark?" she called, but there was no answer. The flickering light was starting to get on her nerves, so she hurried to the sink to wash her hands. As she looked up into the mirror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Behind her, in the reflection, was a figure tall, gaunt, and shadowy, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Jess spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there. She stared at the empty room, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. What the hell? Suddenly, the lights in the restroom went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight and pointing it around wildly, but the room was empty. Without wasting another second, Jess bolted out of the restroom and back into the main area of the rest stop. Mark and Emily were standing by the vending machines, looking at her in confusion. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, noticing the panic on her face. There was someone in there, Jess stammered, her voice trembling. I saw something. Emily frowned. Are you sure? We didn't see anyone come in. I'm telling you, I saw something. Jess insisted. Mark exchanged a glance with Emily. Let's just get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps. They all hurried back to the car, the unease growing stronger with each step. As they approached, they noticed something strange. The car doors were open, even though Jess was certain she had locked them. What the? Mark started, but Jess cut him off. Get in the car. Now, she ordered. They piled into the car, and Jess turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, but didn't start. She tried again, but the car refused to turn over. Come on, Jess muttered frantically, trying the key again and again. Why isn't it starting? Emily's voice was edged with fear. I don't know. Jess shouted, her panic rising. She tried the key one last time, and finally the engine roared to life. Thank God. Mark breathed a sigh of relief. Let's get out of here. Jess floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, speeding away from the rest stop. As they drove back onto the highway, the fog seemed to close in around them, thick and suffocating, but something was wrong. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the rest stop kept appearing in the rearview mirror, no matter how far they drove. Jess, why is it still there? Mark asked, his voice shaking. I don't know. Jess cried, glancing in the mirror. The rest stop loomed behind them, as if it were following them, its dilapidated structure standing against the darkness. Just keep driving, Emily whispered, clutching her seat. We'll get away. But no matter how fast Jess drove, the rest stop never disappeared. The same street lamp, the same building, the same desolate parking lot. It was as if they were trapped in a loop, unable to escape. Then, as suddenly as it started, the fog lifted. The rest stop was gone, and they were back on the open highway, the stars twinkling in the clear night sky. Did that just happen? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jess didn't answer. She just kept driving, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. None of them spoke for a long time, the silence heavy with the fear they all felt. After what felt like an eternity, they saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Jess slowed down and pulled into a gas station at the edge of town, her hands trembling as she turned off the engine. We need to stop, she said quietly. I need to get out of this car. They all got out, their legs shaky as they stood in the bright lights of the gas station. The attendant inside looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing in concern. You folks okay? He asked. Jess opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just nodded, her mind still reeling from what had happened. Mark stepped forward. We just had a weird experience at a rest stop a few miles back, he said, trying to sound casual but failing. The attendant's expression darkened. Rest stop? There's no rest stop for at least 50 miles from here, Mark frowned. No, we just stopped there. It was old, run down. The attendant shook his head. You must be mistaken. There's no rest stop on this road. Not anymore anyway. Emily's eyes widened. What do you mean, not anymore? The attendant hesitated, then sighed. There used to be a rest stop back in the 70s, but it was shut down after a series of incidents. People went missing. Some say it was haunted, cursed even. They tore it down years ago. The three friends stared at the man in stunned silence. But we were just there, Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. The attendant shook his head again. You must have seen something else. There's nothing there now. Mark, Jess, and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. the reality of what they had experienced slowly sinking in. "Let's just get a room for the night," Jess finally said, her voice trembling. "We'll figure this out in the morning." They checked into a nearby motel, each of them too shaken to speak. That night, as they lay in their separate beds, none of them could sleep. The image of the rest stop lingered in their minds, the darkness pressing in around them like a suffocating blanket. And as Jess stared at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. That somewhere in the shadows, the rest stop was still waiting for them, waiting for its next victims. Story 2. The Hitchhiker's Curse. The night was cold and moonless as David and Lisa drove along the winding mountain road. They had been on the road for hours, making their way through the remote, forested hills of the Pacific Northwest. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches twisting and intertwining above, creating a canopy that blocked out the sky. "We should have taken the highway," Lisa muttered, glancing nervously at the dense forest outside the window. "This road is giving me the creeps." David, who was behind the wheel, shrugged. "The GPS said this was the fastest route. Besides, it's kind of an adventure, right?" Lisa wasn't convinced. "I just want to get to the cabin. It's late, and I'm tired." David nodded, understanding her unease. They had rented a secluded cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the stress of their jobs and the city. But the drive had taken longer than expected, and now they were miles away from civilization, with no sign of the cabin in sight. As they rounded a bend, the headlights of their car caught something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road, half hidden in the shadows. David slowed down, squinting to get a better look. "Is that a hitchhiker?" Lisa asked, leaning forward in her seat. Sure enough, it was a man standing on the edge of the road, his thumb outstretched in the universal gesture for a ride. He was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair that hung down over his face. His clothes were ragged, and he looked as though he had been out in the elements for a long time. "Should we pick him up?" David asked, though his voice was uncertain. Lisa hesitated. The man looked strange, out of place, and something about him set off warning bells in her mind. But they were in the middle of nowhere, and the temperature was dropping fast. "Maybe he needs help," she said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. David nodded and pulled the car to a stop a few feet ahead of the hitchhiker. The man walked slowly towards them, his movements stiff and unnatural. Lisa rolled down her window just a crack, enough to speak to him, but not enough to let him reach inside. "Do you need a ride?" she asked. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was soft and hoarse when he replied, "Yes, thank you." There was something off about the way he spoke, as if he was struggling to form the words. Lisa glanced at David, who gave her a small nod. Reluctantly, she unlocked the back door, and the man climbed into the back seat. "Where are you headed?" David asked as he started the car again. The man didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Just up the road." Lisa shivered, not just from the cold. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She turned in her seat to get a better look at the hitchhiker, but the darkness in the back seat seemed to swallow him up. All she could see were the faint outlines of his gaunt features and the way his eyes seemed to glint in the darkness. "We're heading to a cabin," David said, trying to make conversation. "Is that near where you're going?" The hitchhiker was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and ominous. "You shouldn't go to the cabin." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "Why not?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, and in the dim light of the dashboard, Lisa saw his eyes for the first time. They were dark, almost black, and they seemed to bore into her, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Fear? Anger? Desperation? Turn around, the man said, his voice more insistent. Turn around now. You're in danger. David glanced at Lisa, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. What do you mean? What kind of danger? The hitchhiker's gaze shifted to David, and he leaned closer. There's something out there. In the woods. It's been following me for miles. It wants. It needs. He trailed off, his voice breaking, and Lisa felt her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to ask what he was talking about, but before she could speak, the man suddenly screamed. Turn around now. He shouted, his voice cracking with panic. David slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the deserted road. The hitchhiker was thrashing in the back seat, his hands clawing at the door as if he was trying to get him out of the car. Lisa cried, fear gripping her, but before either of them could move, the hitchhiker threw open the door and stumbled out into the road. He ran into the woods, his ragged form disappearing into the darkness. David, we need to go, Lisa urged, her voice trembling. David didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car sped down the road, leaving the hitchhiker behind. They drove in silence for several minutes, both of them too shaken to speak. What the hell was that? David finally muttered, his voice strained. I don't know, Lisa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But we need to get to the cabin now. David nodded, though he didn't share her urgency. Something about the hitchhiker's warning had unnerved him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was out there in the woods, following them. They drove for what felt like hours, the road winding through the dense forest with no sign of the cabin. The GPS was still showing that they were on the right path, but the sense of dread that hung over them was growing with every passing mile. Finally, they saw the turn-off for the cabin, a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. David slowed down and took the turn, the car's headlights casting eerie shadows on the trees as they drove deeper into the forest. There it is, Lisa said, pointing to a small clearing up ahead. The cabin stood at the center, its wooden structure dark and foreboding against the night sky. David parked the car, and they both got out, their eyes scanning the dark forest around them. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Let's get inside, David said, grabbing their bags from the trunk. They hurried to the cabin, Lisa fumbling with the keys before finally unlocking the door. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them with a sense of relief. The cabin was small and cozy, with a stone fireplace, a couple of armchairs, and a table in the center of the room. A staircase led up to a loft where the bedroom was located. This is nice, Lisa said, though her voice was still shaky. She set her bag down and went to the fireplace, trying to get a fire started. David didn't respond. He was standing by the window, staring out into the dark forest. David, Lisa called, her tone cautious. Something's out there, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the trees. Lisa walked over to him, peering out the window, but all she saw was darkness. There's nothing out there, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. David shook his head. No, there's something. I can feel it. Lisa placed a hand on his arm, trying to comfort him. It's just the hitchhiker's words getting to you. There's nothing out there. David didn't reply. He continued to stare out the window, his expression tense. Let's just relax, Lisa suggested. We'll have some wine, get some sleep, and in the morning, everything will be fine. David nodded slowly, though he still looked uneasy. Lisa busied herself with opening a bottle of wine while David finally tore himself away from the window and sat down in one of the armchairs. They drank in silence, the crackling of the fire, the only sound in the room. But the unease lingered, a heavy presence that neither of them could shake. After a while, Lisa yawned. "I'm exhausted. Let's go to bed." David nodded and followed her up the stairs to the loft. The bed was comfortable, but as they lay down, the sense of dread only grew stronger. "Do you think he was telling the truth?" David asked quietly, staring up at the ceiling. Lisa hesitated. "I don't know, but we're safe here. Let's just try to sleep." David didn't reply, and soon Lisa's breathing slowed as she drifted off to sleep. But David lay awake, his mind racing, the hitchhiker's warning echoing in his head. Hours passed, and David finally started to drift off when he heard a faint noise from outside. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was soft, like something moving through the trees. Slowly, he got out of bed and crept to the window. The forest outside was dark, but as he strained his eyes, he saw something moving between the trees, a shadowy figure, just barely visible in the moonlight. David's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall and gaunt, its movements slow and deliberate. It was coming closer, its form becoming clearer as it approached the cabin. David backed away from the window, his hands shaking. He stumbled back to the bed, shaking Lisa awake. "Lisa, wake up," he whispered urgently. Lisa groaned and opened her eyes. "What is it?" "Something's outside," David said, his voice trembling. "It's coming for us." Lisa sat up, her heart racing. "What are you talking about?" But before David could reply, there was a loud knock on the door downstairs. The sound echoed through the cabin, and Lisa's blood ran cold. "Don't answer it," David whispered, his voice filled with fear. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Who's there?" Lisa called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, just the steady, rhythmic knocking. "David, what do we do?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide with terror. "We need to hide," David whispered. "Now." They scrambled out of bed and hurried down the stairs. The knocking continued, relentless, as they ran to the back of the cabin. They found a small closet and squeezed inside, holding their breath as the knocking grew louder and louder. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and Lisa could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. They waited, barely daring to breathe, but there was no sound from outside. After what felt like an eternity, David slowly opened the closet door. The cabin was still, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire. "Maybe it's gone," Lisa whispered. Though she didn't believe it, David nodded, but as they stepped out of the closet, the door to the cabin slowly creaked open. They froze, staring at the door in horror as it swung wide, revealing the dark figure standing in the doorway. The figure stepped inside, its tall, gaunt form towering over them. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and as it moved closer, they could see its face pale, twisted, with a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across its features. "You didn't listen," the figure hissed, its voice low and menacing. "Now it's too late." David and Lisa backed away, their hearts racing as the figure advanced on them. "What do you want?" David demanded, his voice shaking. The figure's grin widened. "Your souls," it whispered. "You're mine now." With a sudden, inhuman speed, the figure lunged at them. Lisa screamed, but before they could react, everything went black. When they opened their eyes, they were no longer in the cabin. They were standing on the side of the road, the same road where they had picked up the hitchhiker. The car was gone, the forest around them silent and dark, but they were not alone. The figure stood a few feet away, its grin still fixed on its face. "You'll never leave," it whispered, its voice echoing in the stillness. "You're cursed to wander these woods. Forever." David and Lisa looked at each other, terror in their eyes. They turned and ran, but no matter how far they ran, the road never ended, the forest never thinned. The figure followed them, always just a few steps behind, its sinister laughter echoing through the trees, and so they ran, doomed to an endless night, forever haunted by the curse they had unknowingly brought upon themselves. Story 3. The Ghosts of Highway 13. The long-haul trucking life wasn't for everyone, but for Sam Richards, it was the only life he'd ever known. He had been driving across the country for nearly 20 years, hauling goods from one coast to the other, navigating the highways and backroads of America. There was a certain peace in the solitude of the open road, a rhythm to the hum of the engine and the miles slipping by under his tires. But there was one route he avoided whenever possible: Highway 13. A narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forests of the Northeast, Highway 13 had a reputation among truckers. It was notorious for accidents, strange sightings, and worst of all, disappearances. Sam had heard the stories from other drivers how people would vanish without a trace, their vehicles found abandoned along the roadside, but no sign of the driver or passengers. So when his dispatcher sent him a route that included a stretch of Highway 13, Sam was less than thrilled. But it was late, and he was too tired to argue. He had a load of perishables that needed to be delivered by morning, and the quickest route was through the cursed highway. Sam set out from the last truck stop before Highway 13 with a full tank of gas and a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The night was clear but moonless, the stars twinkling faintly in the inky sky. He hoped to make it through the highway without incident, focusing on the road ahead and keeping his mind off the eerie tales he'd heard over the years. As he approached the turn off to Highway 13, a chill ran down his spine. The entrance to the highway was marked by a rusted, faded sign that barely caught the glare of his headlights. Highway 13, enter at your own risk. Sam shook his head, trying to dismiss the growing unease in his gut. It's just another road, he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Just another road. But as soon as his truck's tires hit the pavement of Highway 13, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, the darkness around him seemed to deepen, and the trees that lined the road appeared to close in, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab him. The road was eerily quiet. No other vehicles, no wildlife, just the sound of his engine and the occasional creak of the truck's frame. Sam turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the oppressive silence, but all he got was static. Damn it, he cursed under his breath, switching the radio off. The silence returned, even more suffocating than before. He drove on, the miles ticking away slowly on the odometer. The highway twisted and turned through the dense forest, the road narrowing with each passing mile. The further he drove, the more uneasy he became. Something wasn't right. Then, in the distance, Sam saw something on the side of the road. At first, it looked like a shadow, but as he got closer, he realized it was a figure standing on the shoulder, right at the edge of his headlight's reach. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, a tattered jacket and worn trousers, like something out of a black and white photograph from a century ago. Sam slowed down, squinting at the figure. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were hollow, staring straight ahead as if he didn't even see the truck approaching. "Hey, you need help?" Sam called out, rolling down his window slightly. But the man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, as the truck rolled past him. A shiver ran down Sam's spine. He checked his mirrors, but the figure had vanished, swallowed up by the darkness. What the hell was that? He muttered, accelerating a little faster than before. His heart was racing, but he tried to push the incident out of his mind. Maybe it was just a hitchhiker or some local wandering around in the dark. Nothing to worry about. But then he saw another figure up ahead. This time it was a woman standing in the middle of the road, her long hair flowing in the wind, her dress billowing around her like she was caught in a storm. Sam slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt just inches from her. Jesus Christ! Sam gasped, his hands shaking on the wheel. The woman didn't move. She just stared at him, her eyes wide and unblinking, filled with a sadness that seemed to reach out and pull at his soul. "Are you okay?" Sam called out, his voice trembling. But the woman remained silent. Something wasn't right. Sam's instincts were screaming at him to get out of there, but he was frozen, unable to look away from the woman's haunting gaze. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman stepped to the side, walking off the road and disappearing into the trees without a sound. Sam didn't wait to see where she went. He floored the gas pedal, his truck lurching forward as he sped down the highway. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with fear and confusion. What the hell was going on? He drove faster, the road winding treacherously through the forest. The trees seemed to close in even tighter, their branches forming a tunnel of darkness that swallowed the light from his headlights, and then he saw a car on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing weakly. It was an old model, maybe from the 1960s, rusted and covered in dirt. Sam slowed down, pulling up alongside the car to see if anyone was inside. The driver's seat was empty, but there was something on the passenger side that caught his eye. It was a newspaper, yellowed with age, sitting on the seat as if it had just been placed there. The headline read, "Family of 4 mysteriously vanishes on Highway 13. Sam's blood ran cold." He knew that story. It was one of the legends that haunted this highway, a family that had disappeared without a trace, their car found abandoned on the side of the road, just like this one. "This can't be happening," Sam whispered to himself, his eyes wide with terror. He glanced at the odometer, willing the miles to go by faster, but the numbers seemed to be moving slower than ever. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the figures he had seen, the eerie car, the newspaper. It all felt like a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. Then, up ahead, he saw it, a glowing light in the distance, faint but growing brighter as he got closer. It wasn't a headlight or a street lamp. It was something else, something otherworldly. As he drew nearer, the light took shape, and Sam's breath caught in his throat. It was a ghostly procession, figures dressed in old-fashioned clothing, walking slowly down the middle of the road. They were translucent, their forms flickering like the flame of a candle in the wind. Sam's hands trembled on the wheel as he slowed down, unable to believe what he was seeing. The figures moved in unison, their faces blank and expressionless, as if they were trapped in a loop, repeating the same action over and over again. He tried to swerve around them, but the road was too narrow, the trees too close. He had no choice but to stop, his truck idling just a few feet away from the ghostly figures. For a moment, everything was silent. Then one of the figures, a young girl with a doll clutched in her arms, turned her head and looked straight at Sam. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to bore into his soul. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, her face twisted in pain, and she reached out toward him, her fingers stretching unnaturally long. Sam recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. "No, no, get away," he shouted, but the girl kept coming, her hand passing through the glass of his windshield as if it wasn't even there. He screamed, slamming the truck into reverse, the tires squealing as he backed away from the ghostly procession. The figures faded into the darkness, their forms dissolving into the night. But Sam didn't stop. He kept going, his truck careening backward down the narrow road until he finally found a spot wide enough to turn around. He floored the gas, speeding back the way he had come, desperate to escape the horrors of Highway 13. The road twisted and turned, the trees whipping by in a blur, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get out, to put as much distance between himself and that cursed highway as possible. After what felt like an eternity, Sam saw the rusty old sign marking the end of Highway 13. He burst onto the main road, his truck fishtailing as he swerved onto the pavement, the headlights of passing cars glaring in his eyes. He didn't stop until he reached the nearest truck stop, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely park the truck. He stumbled out of the cab, his legs weak, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. Inside the truck stop, the bright lights and the hum of conversation felt surreal, like he had stepped into a different world. He found a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee, his hands still trembling as he tried to steady himself. The waitress noticed his pale face and the sweat beading on his forehead. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Sam nodded shakily, though he knew he wasn't okay. "Just had a rough drive," he muttered. The waitress gave him a sympathetic smile and placed the coffee in front of him. "Where were you driving from?" "Highway 13," Sam replied before he could stop himself. The waitress's smile faded, and she glanced around nervously. "You're lucky to be here," she said quietly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not everyone makes it off that road." Sam looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. "They say the road is cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who died there, trapped forever in a loop, reliving their final moments over and over again." Sam felt a chill run down his spine. "But I saw them. They looked right at me." The waitress nodded solemnly. "They do that sometimes. They're looking for someone to take their place, to break the curse. But you got away. You're one of the lucky ones." Sam stared into his coffee, his mind racing. He had always thought the stories about Highway 13 were just that, stories. But now he knew better. He had seen the ghosts, felt their despair, and narrowly escaped their grasp. He didn't finish his coffee. He didn't even say goodbye to the waitress. He just paid his bill and walked out of the truck stop, the cold night air hitting him like a slap in the face. As he climbed back into his truck, he made a silent vow. He would never drive Highway 13 again, and he would warn every trucker he met to do the same. But as he drove away, heading for the safety of the interstate, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts of Highway 13 were still watching him, waiting for their chance to drag him back into the darkness. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.